I'm going to talk about the flight and fight response and how that influences our sensory processing. Imagine you're in a dark alley on your own at night in a really dodgy part of the city. It's a really long alleyway with doorways on either side. They're just deep enough so that you can't quite see who might be lurking in there. You get halfway down the alley, it's a really long way to go back now, and then suddenly something brushes across the back of your neck. How are you going to respond? You can probably imagine yourself screaming, running as fast as you can out of there, turning round and whacking whatever it is that's just brushed behind you, or maybe even freezing and not being able to do anything. This is a normal response. You're in a fight or flight stage. We raised your arousal levels, we put you in a scary situation, and you had a sensory stimulation that led to a fight or flight response. It's what we did when we were cavemen. It's what we're supposed to do. It keeps us safe and protects us. And when we have a response like this, we're ready to fight or run. So our heart rate increases. The blood starts pumping to our muscles really quickly. We get flushed and we get hot because we need to be ready to respond to a dangerous situation. If I told you that the brush across the back of your neck was simply the collar in your coat that had just moved, you'd probably laugh at yourself now. But because you were in a high state of arousal, it was a normal response. If I'd said, imagine you're walking through the park on a sunny day and something brushes across the back of your neck, what would you have done? The chances are most of you would have put your hand to the back of your neck to find out what it was, without any more thought or fear or unusual response attached to that. That's a completely different response to exactly the same stimulation. And that's because you weren't afraid. You weren't in a fight or flight situation. There was no stress associated with that stimulation. Lots of children who have sensory processing difficulties are stressed a lot of the time. It might be because they have an autism spectrum disorder and they're struggling to understand what's going on, to read other people's facial expressions, to understand the subtleties of language and communication. Maybe they're out of their routine and we know how important that is for them. And so naturally, when they get a stimulation in the classroom, someone walks by and brushes the back of their neck accidentally, they may well have a fight or flight response. They turn round and hit that person, accusing them of hurting them. They cry, they hide under the table, or they maybe run out of the room. That response seems totally out of proportion to the stimulation they've just received. But this is just like you in the dark alley. And it's important to recognise that and remember that when you're struggling to understand why your child has had such an out of proportion response to a stimulation. If we were to put this kind of state or response into a category, we might say there were 3 different types of children. Children with high arousal levels, children with low arousal levels, and children who are seeking sensation. Let's look at those 3 types of children. A child with high arousal levels will probably be oversensitive to noise and movement and touch. They'll try to avoid and escape the activities and the environments, the people and the situations that bring those sensory experiences. Their reactions are likely to be emotionally charged. They'll get upset very quickly and quite extremely. And if you imagine yourself when you've been in a frightening situation, it's often a natural response at the end of that to burst into tears. That's what our children are experiencing. These children often find transition and change really difficult. It's helpful to think back to the dark alley scenario to understand why that might be. If you imagine I'd told you that you needed to go down this alley, that it would take 5 minutes and that your mum would be at the end and she'd pick you up and everything would be okay, you may well have been scared, but you might have agreed to do it. If you got halfway down the alley and I suddenly said, "Oh, sorry, no, we're not going that way anymore. We need to go down a different alley, and I don't know where it goes, and I don't know who'll be down there, and I don't know who'll pick you up at the end, but do you mind just going?" The chances are you would have turned round and said no. You were only just coping with the first dark alley, and because I'd added some parameters about how long it would take and what the end point would be, you were probably going to do it. But as soon as we take that away, you're much more likely to refuse or have a meltdown. And that's probably what happens to children whose routine is changed at the last minute, who were already stressed and only just coping, and suddenly that's gone out of the window. So when grandma arrives out of the blue and your child won't come downstairs to see her, it's not because they don't love grandma, it's because they're already in a high state of stress, and this is now another event that's out of their routine and out of their control, and they just can't manage it. Sometimes children with sensory processing difficulties have arousal levels that are too low. These children tend to be quite under-responsive, they're quite passive and difficult to engage, they might miss cues, and they don't respond to normal stimulation. They're often much easier to manage in a classroom setting, for example, because they may sit quietly at the back in their own world, but they're often not learning, and that needs addressing. The third type of child we mentioned is the sensory seeker. These children have an under-responsive system and low arousal levels, but they want to do something about it. They want to raise their arousal levels to that normal range because that's where it's fun and that's where you can learn. They have to do things to get themselves there. They might be fidgeters, chewers, fiddlers, move around a lot, maybe make a lot of noise. This raises their arousal levels, but often they can go beyond that. They can spiral out of control. So these children will try to obtain sensory input to improve their attention and focus and get some pleasure out of activities. They can be quite high energy and impulsive with it, can't sit still, like crashing around and touching and bumping into everything and everyone. But they can spiral out of control and become a bit of a safety risk.